flavor today, and I am super excited about it, frankly. I'm just thrilled to be in this conversation today with two good friends of mine, Grahame Beresford and Tim Lyles. We are going to be talking about the documentary, The Beatles Get Back, which I saw about a month ago and cannot stop thinking about it. And as a way to try to stop talking to strangers about it and haranguing people in my life who have yet to see it, I'm going to get all that out in a conversation with Grahame and Tim today about the impact of this documentary, what was going on with the Beatles at the time. And so that's what we're going to do today. A little different. We normally we talk a little news, we talk some politics, we talk faith, we talk science and economics and a bunch of do-goodery. But there was just something so good happening in the midst of this podcast or this documentary that we're going to do a podcast about it. So, all right, Grahame, Tim, would you each do a little brief introduction of yourself and let us know like your own connection to the Beatles? I will say for me, I was not a huge Beatles fan. Liked the Beatles like everybody else, understood their influence, looked on my own like device and playlists, not much Beatles music. I feel like I knew it. It was just always around. Then I watched this documentary and the crush I developed on these guys and the commitment. And I've listened to almost nothing since other than the Let It Be and Abbey Road albums. It's just been a crazy deep dive. But I know each of you are a little different. You're professional musicians. You've been influenced in so many other ways. So anyway, Grahame, would you give us a little background on you and your connection to the Beatles overall?
Yeah. So the first time the Beatles kind of showed up on my radar was actually on Sesame Street. They had a little puppet band called the Beatles, and they were like little bugs with the, antenna, and they would sing "Let Her Be, Let Her Be, Let Her Be," and things like that. And so that was kind of the first. I was like, oh, that's kind of, even as like a 6-year-old, I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I heard that they were actually a band. And right about, when I was like, I don't know, fifth grade, I started really getting into like oldies. Because before that, my music tastes were like Raffi and, whatever like contemporary Christian music my parents were, had on the car, stereo or whatever. So I discovered my parents' Beatles records and just like, in 6th grade, I remember I would lay on the shag carpet in the office and nonstop listening to these records and looking at the pictures on the back. And I loved, my favorite one was there was a US LP called Something New, and it was a picture of them playing the Ed Sullivan Show. And I would like sit there and look at this picture and like impose myself on each of these, guys sitting up there playing guitars or playing drums. And it just like absolutely rocked my world and was the reason that I then started playing bass. And my dad's a musician, and he had this old bass in a closet, and I was like, I want to play that. And so he taught me the bass part for I Saw Her Standing There. And it's just like a super basic foundational, bass part. And that was basically it. I spent the entire summer in front of the record player with my chin on the bass because we didn't have an amp. So I would play the bass and the vibration would go through my chin and I could hear it in my head.
Wow.
And that was basically like all of those early, American Beatles records and like the Beach Boys birds. Those were like, that was my musical gospel. And
you never got out of the letter B after all that time on Sesame Street, right? You
right,
got trapped with the
exactly,
Beatles, the Beach Boys, and the Beatles.
Yeah, exactly. So that was like my musical education, and that continued for a long time. I always loved the Beatles, and then I was in my 30s, and I ended up joining a Beatles tribute band, which was really fun. I played, I had auditioned. Like the 2007 for Ringo, and was ended up joining another band at that time, but I did a fill-in gig for them. And then one day the guy called me and he said, "Hey, we need a fill-in John Lennon. What do would you be interested in auditioning?" And I said, "Sure." So I went over. Oh, actually, no, he was auditioning another guy for the job, and he said, "Hey, I need a drummer." That's what it was. He said, like, "I need a drummer. Would you come and just help me audition this guy?" And I said, "Sure." And so it was like the gig was like 2 weeks away, and the guy that was doing the John Lennon part just did not have the right voice. It was like very kind of deep and gravelly, and it was just not. It didn't go well, and so he was freaking out, and he was just like, "I've got this gig in 2 weeks. I don't have a John Lennon. I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, dude, I've been playing these songs since I was like 12. Let's just, let's try it out." So we sat down and ended up just him and me, and we were singing the harmonies and all that stuff. And so I was his John Lennon for about 6 months, and then the drummer quit. And I said, and we couldn't find a drummer that could play a shuffle and sing at the same time. And so then I was like, well, I'll tell you what, let's find a John Lennon, because it's going to be easier to find a guitar player that can do his part than a drummer. So then I switched over and was Ringo for about 2.5 years. And then I've played in a couple of other, Tim actually knows a bunch of the musicians that I've played with, because a lot of them are McNally Smith folks. But
Menard,
I was in,
Menard and Arisman.
Yeah, yep, exactly. And so we did, I did a show, a few shows with some McNally folks where we played Abbey Road from beginning to end, and had a brass section and everything. It was just awesome. And then the bass player from that band and a couple of other folks and I did another tribute for about a year, where it was all of their post-Beatles stuff. So Plastic Ono Band, and we did some Wings tunes, and also kind of some of the late era Beatles stuff to kind of tie everything together. So most of my music life has sort of revolved around the Beatles.
So it's safe to say you are a super fan and and a
totally.
musician. Tim, how about you? What's been your background with the Beatles?
I think a good perspective on people's viewpoints of the Beatles has a lot to do with their birth decade, And I think in lieu of full disclosure, we should all three, give our birth year. I was born in 1958. I'm going to guess Pagitt was born in the late 70s.
1966. What about you, Grahame?
And Grahame probably
77.
80s.
1977. So the 50s, 60s, and 70s represented here on the podcast. That's great.
There you go.
And then not unlike Grahame, having a musical father and other siblings who are very creative and talented. I had two much older siblings, 8 and 6 years older than I, who were strumming guitars in the folk music craze in the early 60s. But February of 1964, the Beatles came to the U.S., Ed Sullivan's show. I was very young, but we all watched that stuff, and it was like a lightning bolt through the skull, And both my siblings, still stayed, very folk music oriented, but especially my older sister, started buying those albums. And I remember being in the first grade. I think maybe the 45s, the small vinyl 45s, were, probably 50, 60 cents a piece. So when I was in the first grade, I had enough coin to buy a couple of their early singles. But my older sister had the Meet the Beatles LP. And I remember being in first grade and taking it to show and tell in school. Everyone had, toys and children's books. And I brought a Beatles album to first grade for show and tell, and they wouldn't play it. Very disappointing.
Something.
I've been kind of like a guitar player and a guitar teacher and a music nerd and a session guy, through my adult life. And, ever since 1964, I've just never stopped being in love with the Beatles and delving into their oeuvre and studying as much of the details about them as I can. Boy, once DVDs came out, I just bought everything that I could. There are quite a number of black market Beatle bootlegs that were just mind-blowingly revealing to me how many takes they would do of a song before they got it perfect. And boy, just anything having to do with the Beatles, I was into, and a little bit of the post-Beatle period. I absolutely love Paul McCartney's Ram album, but Wings not as much. And I think the All Things Must Pass album from George Harrison was, pretty brilliant. A 3-album, box set. And of course, Imagine and some of the other things that John did. But I'm really hyper focused on the Beatles. There was just something about the alchemy between those 4 personalities that made everything come out differently than if you had hired professional session musicians or something. I'm just totally in love with all of them. When I'm asked who my favorite Beatle is, I always say George, but it's George Martin, the George I'm talking about.
Oh, really? Okay, so he plays a role. All right, so for people who might not know about this documentary yet, I want to ask you guys what your experience with the documentary was. The documentary chronicles basically a 4-week period of time. If you haven't seen the documentary yet, just stop listening to this or watching this and go watch that. It's on Disney Plus. If you don't have a Disney Plus subscription, you can probably get a freebie somewhere, or I don't know, message me. I'll give you my login. I think it's that good. You should watch it. Everybody should watch it. What it does is it's so meta in some ways, right? It's a documentary that uses the footage from a documentary that was made in 1969 about the making of what turned out to be the Let It Be album. So 50 years later, in 2017 or something like this, Peter Jackson, the filmmaker, obtains the rights and is asked to see if he can do something with all this archival footage, video footage and audio footage from what was recorded when they were making this documentary, which came out in a movie in 1970. And he ends up putting all of that together into this, 8-hour-long, 3-part docu-series chronicling the making of this album, which culminates in them up on the, again, spoiler alert here, up on the roof of the building where their studio is, playing music to nobody or out in the street. And I don't know, like 3 of the songs that they did on the roof end up in the album. It's just so amazing, the musicianship. But so that's what the documentary is. It's not a retrospective of all of the Beatles' lives. It's not telling the story of how they came together. It really tells the story of this one short period of time where they're trying to make a TV show and they're going to make a documentary about making of a TV show. They end up not making a TV show. They make this album instead. And you would think this is just a big convoluted mess, but it turns out to be an inside look at the genius of these guys. So tell me your experience with the documentary. I was so impacted by it. I've watched it twice. I get emotional watching it. It was just bananas what's going on in this thing, and I didn't feel like I had anywhere near the commitment that you did, either of you, to their music. Tell me what struck you about the documentary itself and how it has impacted you.
I'll go. So I love seeing the process. I love one of my favorite documentaries is I Am Trying to Break Your Heart, which is a Wilco documentary for their. It kind of shows the the recording and the aftermath of their album Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, which is kind of regarded as their best or one of their best, and in that documentary. One of the things that really drives it is the band gets dropped from their label after they turn in the album, and B, one of the kind of the core guys in the band gets fired, and so you talk about conflict, and there was you sent out a link to an interview with Peter Jackson talking about his process and everything. And if it was 4 guys, and he says, if it was just 4 guys recording an album, like that wouldn't. I mean, that would be interesting for some people, but there's that conflict that's introduced with, we've got to do this show, like we've got a month to do this. How are we going to make this work? and that introduces some conflict into it. And so, if it were just footage of them recording an album and everything was hunky dory and great, I would have still totally been into that, because being a musician, I love that stuff. And a creative person, I love to see how the creative process evolves. But then having this added stuff of, we're not only trying to write these songs, we're trying to write these songs, in a pressure cooker, and figure out a show and manage all of these band dynamics, because like they had just come off of recording the White Album, which was super tumultuous, and manage these kind of relationships of these four super close friends who were like, each of them was kind of ready to move out and explore some new stuff and explore not being a Beatle. And so it's all of this stuff that kind of comes together in this ball of awesomeness. I felt.
Yeah, totally.
I could watch another 8 hours of it. There are other people that I know that are kind of like, well, it's cool, but it was kind of, it got kind of boring. And that's totally fine. I don't begrudge anybody that opinion, but I could have watched twice that much footage.
Tim, how about you? How did the whole documentary strike you? And what were you thinking when you went into it and sat down to watch it as somebody who knows the group so well?
I hope the two of you don't mind if I hold a couple of conflicting opinions, contradictory opinions all in myself. But to play a little bit more of the devil's advocate, I thought it was a little long for my taste, and there was a number of lengths of rehearsals and messing around and jamming through songs that got kind of lengthy for me in the first episode, hoping that it would tighten up in the second and third episode, and it didn't. So that would be my gripe, is that it's Peter Jackson-ish. People had, I think, exactly the same complaint about his Hobbit movie after The Lord of the Rings. Like, he made it into 3, and it was, a little bloated. And I think that, for me, this was not as tight of a documentary as it could have been. So there's my devil's advocate. I loved it so much that I watched all 3 episodes 3 times in a row. And if he had put out, instead of 8 hours, if he had put out 16, I would have climbed through all of it. Yeah. Because there's a mythology or an aura around the Beatles and their albums and their music and reading books about them that just don't come anywhere close to the reality of watching them interact with each other, like Grahame said, in this almost 1 month long pressure cooker. And it was really revealing as a musician to see their processes and just see almost supernatural brilliance pop out of songwriters, on the spot as it's happening, Not like I wrote this a few months ago and I'm bringing it in. No, while they're waiting for John to show up, just watch a song come out of thin air is just magical, dude. Loved it.
Yeah, and these are not just songs, right? I mean, to your point, these aren't just songs that are coming out of thin air. This is like Get Back and Let It Be, and George Harrison is walking around at that one point, and he's saying like, I've got this song. There's something about her. I just don't know the next line. Yep. And like, the next line's the whole thing, and just kind of mundling and mingling and talking with each other. Meanwhile, in the documentary, there's a calendar running. First, they have 2 weeks to produce a show for a television show, and then it turns into 4 weeks before they just have to be done because of other commitments. So it's counting down each day with a calendar. And I'm saying to Shelley, like, I mean, I know something comes out of these albums, but I was saying to her, how are they going to get this thing done in time? Like I felt myself pulled into this story, like somehow I don't know if it's actually going to happen. Not only do they make Let It Be, the whole album, but about half of what ends up on Abbey Road was also written in that room, or sort of experimented on and over the course of that time. Well, I'm going to show one clip that Grahame referred to. This is on a Peter Jackson interview. Peter Jackson's the filmmaker. and he was being interviewed. And the mythology of why the Beatles broke up is a really big part of the story. And a lot of people believe that they, toward the end of their time together, they break up 18 months or so. The band officially ends 18 months or so after the things that you see in this documentary. So they're clearly winding down. There was all kinds of conflict around that. And there were stories about during this creating of this album that they were physically violent with each other, that George Harrison and John Lennon got into a fist fight. And there's all this kind of legend. Well, it turns out Peter Jackson watches through all of this footage and listens to all this audio, and then they have to layer the audio into the footage, and they did a genius job of making a film. I mean, just an incredible way to go about filmmaking with these artifacts. And then you end up seeing in the documentary a totally different story than had been shared and that a lot of people held. So much so that you see in the interview we're going to play here with Peter Jackson, so much so that Paul McCartney himself had misremembered what the period of time was like when they were making this album. And all the other Beatles had. And there's something about this that I find really intriguing, that our memories, our ability to retell ourselves the story of what's happened to us in the past and what we did and how we felt is so much shaped by all the other forces that have followed, not just the forces that were going on at that time. We don't simply have a replay loop in our minds. And certainly there were editorial choices made in this, and maybe there was more conflict than you see in the documentary. But these guys are having fun. They're kind to each other. They're working out issues. It's just an amazing bit of human engagement and interaction. You know, as one of the documentarians who was making the original documentary says, he goes, I don't even know if we have a film here. What I have is a bunch of smokers, nail biters, and nose pickers. Like, I don't even know what we have going on. Like, they're just doing this stuff, right? So, all right, here's this Peter Jackson interview quote. It's about 2 minutes long, and I think really great.
So when you've got Paul and Ringo still alive, who maybe think they have these bad memories, and then you're saying, no, actually, you guys were having a good time and really getting along well and collaborating amazingly. Is that hard to talk them into that? Like, yes, you were having a good time. You just don't remember it.
December 2017, Paul McCartney came to New Zealand for a concert. And I'd seen it all. I had it on an iPad. And so I went into the dressing room and I sort of, shook hands. I said, so Paul, I've seen all the outtakes from Let It Be, all outtakes. And I could see the nervousness on his face, because he hasn't seen the outtakes. I mean, he was there in 1969, but he certainly hasn't seen the footage. And he said, oh, yeah. And he was sort of, I could see there was a trepidation or a dread on his face. And I just said, look, it's whatever you think it is, it's not what you think it is, because I thought it was going to be miserable, but I'm amazed at how funny and happy it is. It's completely different to what I imagined. I could sort of see just me saying that. He said, yeah, what, really? And then I started showing him things on an iPad, and they were only little bits and pieces, but he was starting to look at stuff. And then I went to LA a couple of times at that point, and still pre-pandemic, and visited Ringo and showed Ringo things. And so I think I started to ease them into the idea of the fact that the Let It Be experience was not what they remember. Because they remember the movie in May 1970, as you say, which is they were in the midst of breaking up, and it must have been such a miserable, stressful time for them. But they've somehow imposed all their memories of the Get Back sessions from January 69 on the May 1970 release of the film. So Let It Be for them, it sort of is a symbol of a very unhappy time that they were personally experiencing when the band was breaking up.
I mean, I just think that's fascinating, right? About how much we don't understand our own histories and our own backgrounds, and the stories that we end up telling ourselves don't always match, but they're powerful, right? And then you look back and you see something that was more true and different than you remember it. So often we tend to sort of look at our past maybe with a little fond memory, and then you think back like, well, it wasn't as great as I remembered, because this was the opposite. This was like, these guys were so fun and so creative. What did you each experience about them as people that surprised you from your own, whatever you had constructed about who they were as a band and how they were as human beings, and who the players were? Because, there's children in the mix. There's girlfriends, there's assistants and music producers, and they're all jammed in small little spaces listening to this music. What struck you about how they were different than how you had constructed your own thought on them?
one of the things that struck me the most, referring to some of those mythologies and assumptions, was that lie that Yoko broke up the Beatles is really unfounded. And I think that these 8 hours show that, Yoko is coming to the sessions, which was kind of, unusual for them to have any outsiders at all in their recording sessions. But amazingly, you really see that Yoko is vindicated. She doesn't do anything except to sit there quietly, unless she's tapped on to do her yodeling thing for a little bit to, blow off some steam, or she's painting some calligraphy or something like that. But she's basically, very quiet, not involved in any of it. And I think that really, changes the story about you can see that the Beatles are already going their separate ways.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was very, very heartwarming in one passage to hear Paul go to bat for Yoko and for John and Yoko, and saying, they're in love and it's not a good idea to try and, keep her out. He really seemed to the whole time vindicate, John and Yoko's relationship. That was very heartwarming to me, because I thought that was really a nasty kind of slanted lie against her.
Grahame, what about you? What struck you as something different than you had imagined? Or maybe you knew these guys well enough that this felt like people you knew.
Well, I think for me, so part of being in a Beatles tribute was trying to, at least for me, I kind of thought, I'm not an actor, but there was an element of, when you're doing a tribute, you're also kind of, it helps me at least to know about their personality and what are they like, and how do they talk, and what informs the way that they are, right? And so there's so much stuff that I had read about in interviews and watching the old Beatles anthology when it came out, and all of that stuff. So I wouldn't say that there was a whole lot that surprised me about their personalities. Maybe that Paul, because I'd always kind of, when you read a lot of stuff, it kind of, I sometimes forget that I'm reading, there's other people's opinion injected in that. And really, you can think about it like Michael Lindsay Hogg's original Let It Be documentary paints kind of a dour picture, and it's kind of gloomy and dark. And then Peter Jackson's film paints a totally different picture, and they're all using the same footage. So really, you can kind of extrapolate from that both are true. There was strife going on in the band, and it was a tough time, and they were going their separate ways, and they had a great time. They had a lot of fun together. They clearly loved each other, and I, even years after, in other interviews and stuff, they'd say, I still love these guys. I just don't want to play music with them. I don't want to be the Beatles anymore. So, but I think probably the biggest thing was, I'd always kind of developed this narrative in my mind that Paul was a control freak, and, that Paul kind of took over, everything and made himself the boss. And, he addresses that in the film. I mean, there are times where he's stepping up and making these executive decisions, but it's because nobody else wants to. And somebody has to, they didn't have Brian Epstein anymore. And, and he originally would have made those sort of decisions of all right, boys, we've got to do this show and blah, blah, blah. But he wasn't there. And somebody
he died. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so, he's not wanting to, but he's stepping up in that vacuum, and it put a whole new sort of perspective on that for me. So
yeah, I was really struck by the fact these guys are in their late 20s when this is going on is an amazing thing, right? But a lot of people did a lot of good things in their late 20s, right? So okay, that happens. But as musicians, they're carrying the weight of being the freaking Beatles when they're 27, 28, and 29 years old. Yeah. right? You sort of imagine you're just coming into your own. You're trying to find love. You're trying to figure things out. But you also have to like carry the reputation of the band that went on the Ed Sullivan Show 10 years ago or 9 years ago and shot a lightning bolt through a guy's brain in somewhere in Mississippi. Like you're carrying all of that weight and you realizing this band is going to break up and whose fault is it going to be? And so you're having to manage all that. And in the midst of all of that, their manager, as you mentioned, dies. Somebody's very close to them. A lot of us in our early mid-20s don't experience death that sort of ravages your life like that. So they've got grief going on, all this pressure, all this money that's available to them, right, that could totally upend their lives, which, you know, may have happened years later. And yet in the middle of it, of watching this thing, they are so unpretentious, I couldn't believe it. Like the one point when George Harris is like, can we even get a decent like recording machine in here? Even the Beach Boys have an 8-track recorder. How come we can't get an 8-track recorder? And the guy says, because the Beach Boys are an American band and, you know, EMI cares more about American bands than they do the Beatles. But at no point, and maybe Peter Jackson just cut all this stuff out, do they like throw a tizzy or have a tantrum and say, we're the Beatles for crying out loud? We get what, I mean, at one point they kind of recognize we make all the money for EMI. Like, couldn't they just get us a little some? And then to one point, John is like, couldn't we get some speakers in here so we can hear each other? Because I can't even, they're like 12 days in. And he finally says, you know, he says to George, the producer, I can't even hear anything. It's just a muddled mess. Couldn't we make this at least sound as good as a bar that we've played in before? So I was so struck by the fact that they're making this music and they clearly know who they are. You know, at one point they're talking about renting a ship to take people from England to Libya to be outside to watch them perform this before a live audience. So they know they've got some sway. But they're just eating toast and drinking tea and giving and taking from each other. I was... and watching I mean, I've been around, I'm not a musician. I've only hung around them as an interloper, and traveled with some musicians for some things. And I've been around very gracious musicians, but I also know that a lot of times musicians can be very, you know, demanding and they want things to be just right. And the number of times that I've had musicians say to me like, yeah, I can't work here without a monitor and this microphone isn't good enough and I need in-ear monitors. I'm like, these guys are up on a roof, like with the teeniest little microphone and not a thing, and they're making Let It Be. So there was something about like their sheer raw genius that came out in this unpretentious and just so silly way of being with each other, and how open-handed. I just want one more little soliloquy here. How open-handed they were about the music. I know George really felt he wasn't listened to, and he wasn't, and Ringo never really said anything. But overall, they were just kind of like, I don't know, maybe this will work, and maybe we could swap out this line, and what about this one, and let's not do that, let's do this. There was a kind of kindness there that maybe the British would say, no, that's just British people being British. They're actually seething underneath, and you know they're going to get an ulcer and you know die of intestinal struggles later in life. But they were so kind to each other in the middle of, even when George quits the band. So anyway, I was really struck in episode 1 of all of that. And I didn't see that coming. You know, I knew the Beatles as the Beatles. I, of course, knew, you know, Sir Paul McCartney. And, of course, the way John Lennon had sort of carried himself through the 70s was as a very iconic figure of spiritual enlightenment. And, you know, all of that was sort of what I thought of and thought these guys are, you know, they know how good they are. They always knew how good they were. You're like, oh no, they're just 4 guys trying to make some songs that just happen to be, you know, as good as anybody who's ever tried to do such a thing. Either of you thoughts on any of that? Or let's talk episode 2. What struck you in episode 2? What that sort of middle one? Where this is one where people complain that I don't know if this is what you meant, Tim, but sometimes people complain that the middle episode got a little draggy.
I thought the brilliant point in episode 1 was when you get to see Paul McCartney pull the song "Get Back" out of thin air. You see him starting literally with nothing, strumming a bass almost like you would strum a guitar, and he's kind of humming around, and boom, the melody starts coming out. He throws a few words in there, and you're like, he's writing it on the spot. It's just unbelievable to me.
Unbelievable.
The highlight in episode 2 for me was, of course, Billy Preston.
Yeah.
Grahame, Billy Preston?
Yeah. I would say Billy Preston and them switching from Twickenham Studio to Apple Records. It's just the tone of everything is so, it's like night and day. You know, I mean, not only because Twickenham is dark and, you know, Apple has white walls and it's very bright and everything like that, but just everything about the tenor of what they're doing changes.
Yeah.
When Billy shows up and when they get to the studio, and it's like they're home, you know, and they know that studio and they know the, you know, it's just, everything becomes so much lighter, you know, and Billy showing up and having that, you know, that fresh kind of creative spark and
to set the stage to set the stage for this, for people who don't know, Billy Preston's a musician, typically playing with black bands, Ray Charles and others. He's a rhythm piano player. They happened to meet him a few years earlier in Hamburg, Germany, and just had a short little interaction. He's in town and wants to stop by, as friends, you know, half friends of the Beatles would want to do, and just like say hi. So he walks in, and meanwhile, they've been having a conversation that they really need one more set of hands to make this music if they're going to make it all live without running tracks, which is what they want to do. Well, in walks Billy Preston, and they're like, hey, you got a minute? Would you mind just sitting down over there at the organ? And again, the idea that this is the Beatles saying, I don't know, let's just put this guy in with us. And of course, he just adds so much, so quietly, and starts driving. And you can see it happening, and they're taking him in. They become fans of this guy in real time. And then that conversation that George and Paul and John have, where they're like, well, we should probably, George says, you know, Billy's been around here now for like 5 days. We should probably like pay him because, you know, at least like a studio musician rate. And then John Lennon says, or we could just have him join the Beatles.
He could be a Beatle.
He could be a Beatle. Like here they are trying to figure out where this thing is going to go. What's going to become of the Beatles? And one idea is, let's just have one more person come in. And then John says, oh, in fact, and then, you know, Bob Dylan would probably join, and so would Eric Clapton. Like, the Beatles could just become like a super band where people start coming in and out. And what got to me about that, as somebody who's run organizations and tried to be involved in movements and stuff, people can get so precious about their thing and what is their brand and who is it and who's going to own it and who's involved. And here are the Beatles in real time, just like, I don't know, maybe it's going to be the four of us plus Billy Preston and maybe Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton and maybe some other people, you know, kind of Sgt. Pepper's like. Maybe that wasn't just a spoof. That is, there's a graciousness there that whether you like their music or you think that they're overly simplistic songs or whatever someone's take might be about them, to watch adults take something as valuable as the reputation of the Beatles and to let anybody in on it, let alone to have that kind of open-handed spirit, was just an amazing demonstration of maturity.
Doug, there were 3 things that I thought George Harrison did that aren't really that pronounced in the movie. Some of it's kind of behind the scenes, but it seemed to me 3 things that George did that really was, moved this difficult process along. Was one, at the end of episode 1, George has left the band and they're going to go meet with him, at Ringo's house. And at the beginning of episode 2, they're moving into the Apple offices on Seville Row. So there was obviously, in my mind, some negotiation between the Beatles and George to get him to come back, and he probably made some demands. And getting out of Twickenham was probably George's doing, right? Another thing about the 8-track machine, they have an 8-track machine. It's George Harrison's 8-track machine. It's not EMI's machine. George brings his own recording machine so they can have it.
It's to bring his own gear.
But the third and most Billy Preston-oriented thing that George did is he had these attitude problems with the other Beatles on the White Album, and found that if he brought in Eric Clapton to play While My Guitar Gently Weeps on the White Album, and in this case, George behind the scenes invited Billy Preston to show up.
Oh,
George
he did. I didn't know that. George invited Billy Preston. That's Billy Preston didn't just show up.
No, George invited him because George had learned whenever he was getting, a bad attitude out of Paul and John, he could just bring in one of these brilliant musician friends of his and they would start behaving better. So it was kind of an already tried and true George technique.
Genius. Yeah, so you knew that not from this documentary. You learned that from other interviews and other backstory stuff that you knew?
George said that often, that whenever Paul started getting kind of snitty and everything, he would just bring in a Billy Preston or an Eric Clapton, and they would start behaving differently around these people, And
I think that's amazing. Part of that carried into the Abbey Road sessions too, because Billy played on all the Abbey Road stuff as well, and I wish that it's one of the one thing that I wish we would have gotten to see more of the Abbey Road stuff. Because really, I guess I hadn't totally realized how much how intermingled those sessions were. And obviously Let It Be ended and they took a break and then they went and finished, Abbey Road and stuff like that. But yeah, like it worked so well that they just had him stay on for Abbey Road.
Yeah.
So,
just something else. All right. So then it moves on to, and there's a lot there. Obviously, we haven't covered it all. Other people probably have their own opinions about what we should be talking about when it comes to episode 1 and 2. But then you get into episode 3. I don't know what time frame is left, like 5 days or 7 days before they're going to have to do something because they do have a hard finish on the 30th or 31st of January. And they need to do some kind of a performance. They've now canceled the idea that they're going to do a television show, but they want to perform and make an album in front of people somewhere as they had done on a previous song. And so that's what they're trying to come up with. Where are they going to do it? And all kinds of fanciful ideas are coming up, including going to, Libya and bringing people over on ships and all the rest of it. And at one point, someone sneaks up and says, hey, we have an idea. And maybe that's the end of episode 2, where they say, we have an idea, right? And the idea in 3 is to go up onto the roof and play outside. And then that's going to end up, we'll talk here at the end about the actual experience of them making the music on the roof. But that episode 3 where everything is in trouble, they don't have any songs workable yet. They're coming down to the wire. You both, as people who have had to perform music live in front of others and had to learn it and create it, can you just talk a little bit about what you were experiencing watching that story? When there's now not 30 days left to make an album out of thin air, they now have some bits and pieces, but that last push to actually get something from concept to, something that'll be played on, future digital devices they couldn't even have conceived of 50 and 60 years later, that these are kind of people that want to make something that good. Just what your experience was watching that all unfold.
Made my skin crawl, I have to tell you. I've been under some pressured musical making situations, but the whole project, from the very beginning is like, you're planning on making an album, doing a live television performance, and making a documentary of all of this in 1 month. Are you serious? Yeah. But dude, when it gets down to the wire, those last, couple of weeks, and even the last 3 days, I'm like, Beatles.
The last 2 hours, yeah.
These songs, you're going to have to play them. You've got to do something. It's like you keep goofing around with all these other songs you're jamming on. No, you should be practicing these songs for this album. And it's just chaotic. It really, for someone who's produced recordings and stuff, I broke out in boils.
Yeah, I mean, the real tension, watching that happen in real time, I felt truly nervous, like the mirror neurons in the brain that allow a person to feel another person's experience, even when it's somebody's experience 52 years ago. I'm watching it and thinking, I feel for them right now. How are they going to do it? And just hours before they go up on the roof, they don't know if they're going up on the roof. Maybe minutes before they go out there, they're not even sure that this is what they're going to do. George doesn't want to do it, or then maybe kind of does, and John is like, I don't care about anything. Like, let's just make music. It's just the craziest set of circumstances in that final episode. Grahame, what about you? What struck you in there?
I think the thing that stood out to me was how they basically it was like they kind of determined that what was good enough.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm a what I would call a good enough musician. I'm not. So I kind of play a little bit of everything because I have a hard time kind of focusing on one instrument. And when I practice, I'm not a disciplined player. You know, I don't have a regimen. I don't read music. I'm self-taught, and so there's an element in everything that I do with music that's kind of like, let's just see how it goes. Let's just try it, you know? And that's also kind of my approach through life, is like trying to be, you know, flexible and adaptable and like rolling with change. And I'm okay going up and just winging it, you know? And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. You know, I appreciated the fact that, like, when they, you know, there was a lot of sort of a lot up in the air around like, going into their show, their set, and you know, and even after the set, and I guess we'll get to that, you know, in a minute. But like, I don't know, there's just the fact that they just kind of rolled with it, you know, and there is an element in that where you kind of have to say, okay, well, it's not going to be perfect. It's going to be good enough. And you have to be okay with being a good enough, you know, whether it's a musician or an artist or a parent or, you know, whatever. Sometimes good enough is just good enough, and it's okay. And so, yeah, so it wasn't as much of a nail biter for me, but you know, it was just kind of fun. Like, cool. They're just
well, and I think what you're saying, Grahame, is so important, and also to remember that a lot of people who try that approach to life or say what you say, you know, as an adult, like, look, I just want to. At some point, I think we can just do it, and we can try and experiment and fail. Not everybody says to people who talk like that, "Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's world class." You know, no, people haven't tended to say like, "Well, you know how the Beatles became the Beatles." But just by being good enough and getting out there and doing it, right? We mythologize this reality or this story that's not reality. Hearing Paul and John say to each other when they're talking about playing up on the roof, and there's this little conversation. They have two really important conversations. A little side note here. The one, I think, was in episode 2 when George had quit the band, and they go to lunch, and the filmmakers say the original documentarians had placed a microphone on the table where they're having lunch, unbeknownst to them. And we hear their conversation with each other as friends and near-on brothers, and talking about the family-like dynamics of what's going on and how George had been wounded and they didn't do what they needed to bandage up those wounds, so it's been festering. And Paul saying, like, I think some of that's on me and I don't know what to do and how to, like, it was unbelievably revealing just how much they understood what was going on, right? Because you can get your mindset that, like, these guys should have their heads in the cloud or started doing a bunch of drugs in the late 60s and sort of lost touch. They were super in touch. But to the point we're talking about here, when Paul says to John, do you remember when we played a couple of years ago or months ago and we went out and played and we were really bad and it was really hard to get? It's because we were nervous. And we were so nervous we couldn't play. But then the next night we got a little better, and the next night we got a little better. And he looks at him and says, I think we're just really nervous to do this and nervous to play in front of people. Hearing the Beatles, who have just made now Let It Be, and they've got 18 months left as a band, saying to each other, I think our problem is we're really nervous playing in front of other people. that
They
reality
hadn't
that
played live for 3 years prior to this point. They had not
Right.
played live music. They had felt like they had forgotten how to play together. You know?
yeah, I mean that is just amazing, right? Where they're like, well, we're going to go out, we're going to overcome our nerves, we're going to give it the best we got. It's probably not going to be perfect, but maybe that's good enough. Good enough. I mean, I listening to Let It Be over and over. The way they sung it out on the roof with John kind of talking over it, and just the sheer gutsy level of singing into a little building scape across the street with "Don't Let Me Down," which are the great songs ever. It was. I really appreciate you saying that, Grahame, because a lot of us were involved in a church that I started 22 years ago. And we had that philosophy, and people in the church world were like, oh, that's not how you do it. Like, you have to have intentionality, you have to have plans, you have to execute. What's the 5-year plan? You have to have systems and structure. I get it. We just wanted to do a different thing. And I am so grateful. One of the things that I've been saying to friends about this, when they're like, why should I watch it? Why do I care? And I'll say, if they're in the world that I'm in of shaping and making and creating stuff, I'm like, I'll tell you this. I'm glad I didn't see this back in 1999 before we started this church, Solomon Sports, that we started, because it would have ruined me. Like, had I seen that this level of genius could come, I would have felt like the impulses to have an experimental community where good enough is actually a highly prized, valued thing. I would have thought, maybe I'm just doing that because I saw that that's how the Beatles made Let It Be. Like, it would have interfered with that sense. And so there's part of me that thinks, what a great gift this is to turn this over to another generation to see how it happened. But the other part of me thinks, oh no, you've just explained the magic, and now people will try to replicate the magic, right? Now the formula will be, because I have a friend that when I was writing about this and saying, who wants to talk about it, and somebody sent me an exchange that he had with a coworker of his that's they both teach at universities, and they said, let's create a class at Northwestern University in the art department around this documentary and what it teaches us about the creative process. And there was part of me that's like, oh no, here we go. Now people are going to start teaching about the creative process that these guys were doing because it was real for them, and others try to figure out how to replicate it. So I don't know, there's something, I don't know, like a real gift of seeing the magic and then realizing maybe 4 other guys couldn't just do that up on a roof and have it be, one of the great albums ever. There was something truly unique about these guys. But at the same time, maybe they wouldn't have become truly unique and so good had they not lived in that spirit of it the whole time. I don't know how to put all that together. But
did the two of you notice after watching Beatles' consternation faces for hours prior to that rooftop concert? Did you notice how they looked when they were performing music live together for the first time in 3 years on a rooftop? The joy in their faces. They were just different people. Yeah. Completely.
Just teary-eyed thinking about it right now. And that one point where, I guess Paul's probably talking to George Martin, and he says, look, this happens to us a lot. We get down here and, we struggle and we can't quite get it. But especially John, when we get our backs to the wall and we have to do it,
he comes through.
Like, that's when he becomes John Lennon. Like the John Lennon that There's a transformative, performative quality, right? Like these guys, they knew it too. They were performers. They were performing for the documentarians. That was clear. Probably wouldn't have gone like this had the documentary film crew not been there. They were, they were playing a part. But then when it really came time to play a part, like those movie cameras are pointed at their faces and they've got their instruments in their hand and there's a few people around and they look over the edge and see a street full of people. And they look at each other and like, we're doing that thing we know how to do again, that magic. And okay, so let's talk about the rooftop concert because it's just so great. What struck you about the rooftop itself and how that all came about? And then the final bit of the documentary is the rooftop, and then a few scenes down below as they finish out the album.
I had never seen the entire rooftop concert from beginning to end like that. I had only seen, clips. I had read about like their set list, and I remember the first time reading it, thinking like, I'm gonna I found their set list on the internet or something like that, and I was like, what was the order that they played it in? And then I was like, Get Back. They played Get Back again. Okay, and they played Get Back again.
Yes.
So in a half hour, they played the same song 3 times, and another song, 2 other songs twice. But just seeing all of that and I love that moment where there was they have the 3 camera like frames, for all the rooftop cameras, and the guy, claps the thing, and then those are all in sync, and then showing at the same time like what's going on, downstairs, and the interviews on the streets and stuff, but that they always, they've got that constant, like, we are showing you the uncut, I suppose it's edited, but like the complete rooftop performance from beginning to end. Yeah. And that was, and that kind of goes into the whole like winging it thing. I mean, the fact, like, as a musician, there's like, that's probably the thing that I miss the most since the beginning of the pandemic, is playing music with people and getting on a stage. And there's something about that energy, where you're just doing a thing. And it's a totally different vibe from when you're in a studio or in a practice space or rehearsal space or whatever. And you're like, okay, this is going out for consumption. Like, people are going to hear this. And if we, F it up, they're going to hear that too. So let's just do it. And there was just like this like rawness that is, it's so exciting. And like Tim said, like that joy, it's so evident. And like, just as a viewer watching this thing from 50 years ago, I'm feeding off that energy that they're putting out there.
And it was so good. It was just so good. Tim, what were you going to say?
It was electric. Man, you could just see the electricity, musical electricity going between these 5 performers. It was just amazing. A little behind the scenes thing about the Rooftop, though, I was reading. There's Britain's first, rock and roll freelance recording engineer is Glenn Johns. He's a prominent figure in this documentary. And Glenn Johns says the way they ended up on the Rooftop was because Ringo mentioned to him and Michael Lindsay Hogg, the original filmmaker, that there was a beautiful view of London from the roof. So Ringo took those 2 guys up on the roof and showed it to them. Glenn Johns said he came up with the idea, that he just looked at Michael Lindsay Hogg, said, you should bring him up here and have him play. So it was Glenn Johns' idea. But Ringo took him first just to show them the view.
Isn't that something? Okay, so and what they show with this view, which we don't really see, is buildings, and then a few people on the street, and they've got some amplification going on, and there's a fun bit of where the police try to come to shut it down, and everyone's trying to figure out why they're on the roof. And it's just so great because as a viewer, you're trying to understand, why are they on the roof? Like, why didn't they just go out into a park and set up a sound system and start playing and let people come? Like, there's something about, they were removed yet close. Like they were clearly navigating something, right? Where they didn't want, because after the Rooftop concert, they come downstairs and they basically are so electrified by this, and they're saying things like, hey, we could do it again next week. Like, we could go to another place and play at another, and they never do any of it. But that idea that like they wanted to be up there seemed distant and safe enough. I wondered if that had to do with just they're still worried about what the performance experience was going to look like, and kind of feel like it was kind of a halfway between a session and public, right? They were like just sneaking out a little bit, like climbing up on your roof. And you think about kids in their, when they're putting a band together in the backyard and they just want a few people, maybe their parents and an auntie or uncle or something to be there, but not too many people to hear it because they're not sure, because it's still play. You think about musicians as being people who play music, and that they're really playing up there and making this incredible sound. And the fact that they chose those tracks, when it would come up on the documentary and say, this version is on the Let It Be album. Yeah. Oh, my heart would just, I didn't know which ones had come from the Rooftop. And and I want to ask you what songs you really love off the album and all the rest of that here in a minute. But that whole experience of them finding a way to do this live, but not really, I mean, there's so many things the Beatles could have done to do a little live thing, just they could have just set up, and anywhere they wanted, pulled a little permit and not told anybody and just started playing out somewhere. But they kind of stayed hidden in that castle in this strange little way, right? They like stayed up there. All right. Were you gonna say something, Tim?
No.
All right, songs. What songs really got you on this whole thing?
Grahame?
Well, Get Back brought me to tears, which there's nothing in the song itself that made me feel.
Got a little pause there on the internet from Grahame. Tim, let's jump over to you.
I think the thing that impressed me about the songs of Get Back were after watching the whole documentary a few times. There's a constant, do we have enough songs? They're throwing a lot of songs back and forth, whether they're going to stick or not. But I went through episode 1. The album Let It Be has 12 tracks on it, but 2 of them are rather inconsequential, very short, Maggie May and Dig It. So if you subtract those 2 just short, partial snippets of songs, there are 10 full-length songs. And in the first episode, 9 of those 10 songs are already on their way to being there. It just seemed to me like all these other song considerations clouded their realization, hey, we've got an album here, until like the end of the 3rd episode, George Martin gives them a list of all the songs they played through, and they're like, there's enough for 2 albums here,
Yes, it's just bizarre.
The philosophy behind Let It Be is a very different recording philosophy than Sgt. Pepper's or the final, Abbey Road, which are like George Martin ultimately produced perfect recording technique kinds of things. This was supposed to be 4 guys playing live, leave all the warts and all in there kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And that's what I love the most about this album and any of those songs, that they're just kind of rough. They don't have a sheen or a shine to them. It's just the Beatles playing really endearing songs. But I dig a Pony.
And to your point, my favorite song is Don't Let Me Down. I mean, just sort of always had been, and of Beatles songs. There was something raw about it. And then when I realized, that's on this album. That's created, like in the first episode when you hear John just starting that little beginning, I was like, oh my gosh, is that song, an artifact of this? So I was just following it all the way through those 8 hours. And then he sings it on the roof. He gets to that 3rd verse, can't remember the words. And just scats it, and looks over at Paul, and Paul's just like, yeah, like there. And then that's the version that they put on the album.
It's right? Perfect imperfection, isn't it?
Yeah, and that little bit, I mean, as good as whatever lyrics, because I want to ask you about Beatles lyrics here in a minute, but whatever lyrics you're sort of into, and I want the lyrics to be there. With Beatles music, it doesn't always feel like it's lyrically content driven per se. It's vocalization, and that little vocalization there is the best verse in the whole song. It just feels so powerful and so good. And you can, I will probably never forget, until the Alzheimer's fully kicks in, but how John sort of has that, little sheepish kind of playful look, and Paul's like, no, keep going. Like, don't stop because you forgot the words. And, and they just keep going with it. With the freedom that, we'll just do another cut. We'll just do another cut. We'll just do another cut. But they don't need to, because that turned out to be the one that really was there. And I guess I hadn't thought about this until this conversation, that the phrase "Let It Be," which obviously was, the phrase to a song, that's also kind of what we've been talking about in this, like, it's good enough, right? Just let it be.
Yeah.
Interesting. That had never done, maybe others had, that had dawned on them long ago. But
then
the
it dawned
idea
on the Beatles question.
I wonder if it did dawn on the Beatles.
Kind of prophetic.
So what do you think about this business of their lyrics? One of the things that's caught. I've long been a person who just really likes songwriters who say something, and Tim has mentioned this to me. We've talked about music before. That he said, "Well, you really like music for its vocal content delivery." System as much as the musicianship, and I do, and that was one of the things that kind of made me not always feel as into the Beatles. I'm like, I don't know, they just sing about trivial stuff. And even when I watched, that they started Get Back as a protest song about immigration, especially about Pakistanis in the 60s in England, and then they end up just dropping all that and kind of making it just removing that, which wasn't an accident, I'm sure. Was sort of like, yeah, that's what they do. They're not really saying something. And for a while, I had some critique of it, and then I was talking about it with a friend, and I said, "Oh my gosh!" But see, this is where people like me who try to use music for something else other than its creative purpose, like the fact that it's an artistic creation that evokes something in you that wants you to do and live and be better. That's it. It doesn't need to be saying something else. That is the something else. Like that is the magic of. But do you have any thoughts about that? The words, the lyrics, the sort of intention of the band, what they saw themselves up to in the world?
Well, I know, like for John, a lot of his lyrics were about wordplay, and that's a thing that he talks about that in several interviews and things like that. But like "Please Please Me," that was one of their earliest songs, and he was talking in the anthology about how intrigued he was by the Bing Crosby lyric that was "Please lend your ear," and it's that double, and that's one of the goofy things about English. You can say, I'm going to record a record. And it's three different instances of the same word, and they all mean different things. So no wonder, English is a tough language for people to learn. But, I think that there are things that he just put together, like with Dig a Pony, like I remember having to learn that for my first Beatles gig as John Lennon. And we were going to do that one. I was just like, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do, because it's like the lyrics don't, they don't follow a story. There's not it's not a progression. It's a bunch of words that are thrown together, and they have meaning to John to some extent, but also like he was just playing around with words that sound cool and they sound similar. And he was playing with like the spoken language of it, which is, it's utterly fascinating to me, but it makes it really hard to try and memorize. Yeah. I still haven't memorized those lyrics, but I think there's so much. It's always kind of, I don't know, kind of like low key frustrating to me when people are like, "Oh, it's about drugs." Like, not every song is about drugs just because you don't understand it. Like, "Happiness is a Warm Gun" is not about heroin. It's about a gun ad that he saw in a magazine, and just, there's, so, I appreciate that as somebody who likes writing, I appreciate the, like, let's try and say something, but kind of obfuscate it. So you can't necessarily, so that it's not like, this is exactly what they're talking about.
Yeah. And look, there's probably been no band that's suffered under more "what did the Beatles mean by this, that, and the other thing" than the Beatles, right? I mean, that was just, especially in the 1980s when I was sort of paying attention to music and their music, it was just all about that stuff, playing it backward. I don't know, just all that, like everything had a meaning. And maybe it's because later in John Lennon's life, he becomes someone who uses his words for great social impact. And I think it's hard to separate out sort of the wordplay musician, artist, creative from the 60s, from the 1970s. I want to use words to imagine a different world that's possible and to move people towards certain things. And so he shifts. People change, right? He has a different thing. So I wonder if just all of that, and then just a bunch of people like me that always want songs to have meaning, and for the musician and writer to tell you what they were going through when they wrote it.
How very
It's really a bad habit. Yeah.
What was that, Tim?
How very unpostmodern of you, Doug.
Thank you. Thank you. Been trying to unpostmodern myself for a long time.
Grahame, I would just like to say, just remember you can syndicate any boat you row. That's what I'm saying.
Is that a John Lennon lyric?
Yeah,
That's
right
from
out of
Pony.
I Dig a Pony, with the Moondogs and rolling some lorries and some things. Three baby boomer music heroes: Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Paul Simon. Read their lyrics, man. A lot of those songs aren't very clearly saying something that you want them to say. Not to insinuate that Bob Dylan is not saying, how many roads does it take before they can call you a man, There's certainly meaning in a lot of the lyrics, but dude, read Paul Simon lyrics, it's like, is there a story going on here, or is he just doing wordplay? And that's what musicians and creative people do. They play. You don't work music, you play music, and they're playing around with the language. And that's why some songs are not really great. They have great intentions, but there's this like utilitarian message in it. And the songwriter is not caring enough about how those words sound and roll off of the human voice, how words roll off of the tongue. That's a big consideration for great songwriters, is how you can see the Beatles struggling with that while they're trying to write their lyrics in the midst of this. JoJo Jackson, they're Sweet Loretta Marsh. They haven't quite gotten, the right last name for these people and get back so that it, and when I hear them sing the wrong words, it once again, it creates this, discomfort. And he's like, no, that's not good. Change that. That's not the way it's supposed to be. It eventually becomes...
There's that point where George Harrison's wandering around like, I got this song, something about the way she moves me that... He says, what do you think, Paul? What? And then John chimes in and goes, just sing Cauliflower. Just sing some words until the right word comes to you. And, the line is, if I'm going to mess it up now, but something about it that treats me like no other lover.
Exactly.
And like that, that's the thing that makes that song open up. And you're like, oh, my God. So he knew there was something he was getting at. He didn't know what it was yet and what words would match that thing that he knew. Like that's what you see in this, in the little subtleties of the just jibber jab that's going on in the half playing. And do you remember the one point where Paul says to John something like, hey, I think they're working on The Two of Us or Long Road Home. And he says, like a lot of our songs, like they have to do with going or coming home or getting back or letting it be, or we've got more roads in front of us than memories, or more memories behind us than roads in front. Like maybe that's what we're saying here. And you start listening to that whole album and you see the condition they were in, that this is really a breakup album, right? That's what you're starting to see, right? And that it's about leaving and roads and comings and going. And they didn't know it, but they're discovering that that's what's happening because they had the freedom to let it be. But to let it sort of, sorry about that. To let it come about. So I feel like that's part of this whole thing, right? Is what you see in this documentary. When people say like, it's great to see the creative process of musicians making greatness. Well, yeah, I mean, watching anybody sort of strum up Let It Be or Don't Let Me Down or something about, the way she moves. Get back. Watching people just do that is a magic trick that I'm sure they even look back and are like, I can't do that anymore. Like, how did I do that? I'm sure they're haunted by their own successes, but it's more than that, right? Like there's a deeper level if you kind of, and maybe this is for people who've watched it a couple of times, or I'm going to watch it again after this because I got myself so excited about it.
Same.
But you really start to see this deeper process that's going on, if that's the kind of thing you're into, and this is why I get it that people say it was kind of boring. I kind of wish it had moved on a little more. I'm like, my guess is if you watch it with a certain group of people or a certain friend, they'll point out in those boring moments these things that have sort of captured their heart and kept them in and kept them moving along. And all that. So I don't know. It's just such a. And also, just one more little editorial here. I do want to ask you what you think about their lives post the Beatles, but I just wonder how many other pieces of genius there are in our world that we never get access to. Like, in some ways, a super privileged life of the Beatles. Like, seriously, these four guys, again, get another global look and another generation's recapturing of them. So I get all that. But we didn't have to see this. Had Peter Jackson not been a huge Beatles fan and wanted to set the record straight, had he not had a company that could recolorize all this film, didn't have geniuses and that could take the audio and put it in with syncing up with some video and still shots and other pieces, and just the genius film work that went into making sense out of all this to create a narrative, we wouldn't be having this conversation. All the goodness that does or doesn't come from this wouldn't have been possible. All the other things that we don't know anything about, right, that happened, and they're just gone. No one was capturing them. No one was paying attention. I just realized the world is full of this kind of genius and creativity and beauty and goodness in the midst of all the other things that we need to be different and want to be different. We're still living in a world where that's actually still happening. These things are going on, and we may never know about the 99% of them, but they're the lived experience of some people and a very, very, very real thing. All right. What about their lives after all this? Any comments about that? It's sort of the post-Beatles lives. Do you have anything you want to add?
The breakup was very ugly. Mm-hmm. Any of the ugliness that you see that's kind of like mitigated by the friendliness and stuff quickly goes out the window with Alan Klein and Paul not being on board with a number of things. John and Paul hated this album, which is why it was the second.
This album?
Yes. They hated the way it sounded when it was mixed, which is part of the reason why it's the second to the last album recorded, but it is the last Beatles album released. Abbey Road was released before Let It Be because they had Glenn Johns mix it 2, maybe 2.5 times, and were still very unhappy with the way it sounded. So they brought in the crazy producer. Mm-hmm. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's Phil Spector. Yeah.
The wall of sound.
Yeah, Paul hated what Phil Spector did to his ballads on that, so they were never happy with the album. So that delayed its release. And also it took a good long while before the movie was released, and they wanted to release the album right alongside of the movies. So that didn't happen until late 70s or 71. Late 70s.
1970, I think.
Well, it was recorded in January of 69, but it was not released until like the middle of 1970, I think.
Yeah, a year and a half. It took a year and a half. Wow, that's
very acrimonious split up and legal suing hassles between almost all of the Beatles.
Well, Tim, back to the John's recording. It's interesting you say that because I use Apple Music, and in the Apple Music app, I downloaded the Let It Be album, and they must have re-released one that just came out maybe with this documentary because it has the John's different mixes in it. Like there was like 3 versions. So now all of a sudden I've got 40 Let It Be songs. They're all over the place. And to a neophyte like me, I can't hear the difference, and like some people can, but finally his releases are out in the world, and just seeing that we're sort of glorifying all of this struggle and the good enoughness and all, which is so good and right. But they, even internally, that becomes a frustration, obviously. And so it's good that you filled in the blanks for those of us who have now sudden all this other music on our devices.
Right.
Like, where did that come from? And I don't know if you guys saw, but there's a little recap in one of the magazine of Where Are They Now? The other characters in the movie. That are in the movie, and there's just such tragic stories that have happened to these people.
Mal Evans,
the
Very sad.
big guy who's like their tour manager and support, and
Yeah.
he has a mental health
Notice the
crisis.
look on his face when he gets to bang the Maxwells, and
Yeah. On the,
notice that
Playing
sheer
with the Beatles.
childlike joy. He gets to take a hammer and go bing bing.
yeah.
What
I
a
gotta
lovely
say,
human.
I thought I loved Mal's quick thinking when the cops show up and they're like, "You need to cut the power," and he's like, "Hold on, I've got to go and do this, and I've got to go up to the roof, and then I've got to do this, and then it's going to take a long time." And it just like the stalling, like,
Yes,
way to go, Mal!
What a
Evans.
guy.
Like, he saved the day.
he did save the day, and he made And so you see these backgrounds or the foregrounds and where these people go and what becomes of them, and it's heartbreak and tragic deaths and broken relationships, and George Harrison's wife and, Ringo and Eric Clapton and just like all the things. And it's easy to think, well, with all that, it's just a mess. But then out of it, all this other stuff. And all this other stuff that's so good is also full of all that pain. And pain is not the opposite of this goodness and creation and beauty. It's
Part of it.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you guys are familiar with. I think it's the film Boyhood, and there's a there's a bit of that where the Beatles kind of play into it, and there's the White Album, but I think it's one of the characters in the film makes the Black Album, which is basically like his own album of like this. These are all like the post Beatles songs. That I would have put together to make like the ultimate, post Beatles album. And he writes a letter to his kid. He and the kid's mom are not together. He writes a letter to his kid, and he's like, the Beatles broke up, but they made some beautiful music. And your mom and I broke up, but you're the beautiful music that came out of that. And it's really like you guys talk about that. Just that's kind of what stood out to me. Like. There was a lot of pain and a lot of anger and strife and acrimony, but like so much good music has come out of the kind of iron sharpening iron that was such a huge part of that band.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if anything, the documentary really helped me think about like. These are the treasures that come out of that pressure and that strife.
Yeah, well, and you just consider all the people that had to come together for a documentary to work, right? The original concept of record, and it comes out in the documentary. Maybe in the third episode, there Paul goes, "Hey, you have to remember, like originally we were just going to play our old songs on a TV show." That was the original plan. And we were going to rehearse songs we already knew and then play those and make a TV show and take 2 weeks. But then we decided, no, let's make some new songs. And then it turns into. So it took them and a recording studio and early documentarians and then the Peter Jackson people to come and put all this together. And then Paul and Ringo have to say yes. I was very pleased at the end to see Paul and Ringo as executive producers, meaning it had their sign off on it. So they were at least saying, we're comfortable with this being the story that was told about those days. But all the pieces that had to come together, to, as you say, Grahame, to tell that story that shares the goodness out of it. It just takes all those little pieces, and we're all moving parts in this world of trying to make a story that is understandable and moving and helpful to people. So maybe it's a good point to just let it be, and we'll end.
Come together,
right.
dude.
Thank you for coming together around this, and I got to get back to a few other things, and I got a real long and winding road in front of me.
You're in trouble.
So I'm in trouble. And then that ridiculous song about the axe murderer on there, or the hammer murderer, is just
technically a hammer murderer.
A hammer murderer. I wish it had just been a wordplay song and not like domestic violence. Yeah. Well, hey, anybody that's put up with all of this for an hour and a half, you're either super fans of the Beatles or Grahame or Tim or Vote Common Good World. So we're glad to have you being around, and we'll see you back tomorrow for a conversation about common good politics, which will not be nearly as life-giving or fun as all of this. So thank you for an hour and 24 minutes, my friends, and
Love
Thanks,
it.
Doug.
We'll
Thanks,
see you on
Graham.
the other side.
See you guys.